Are you ready? Let's give this a go. Top stories of the week. Dutton hates Australian citizens. Also, ceasefires that don't cease firing. And, bit long clip, SpaceX or SpaceX. All that and more on News Weekly. Hello and welcome to News Weekly, where we punch the news in the headlines weekly. Dutton's referendum news now. Peter Dutton has a new plan to keep Australians safe. And by new plan, I mean the same plan he's had since 2016. By holding a referendum to give the federal government more powers to deport criminals with dual citizenships.
My argument is that if you betray your allegiance to our country in that way, you should expect to lose your citizenship.
Giving the government the power of deportation, a move that requires constitutional change and a referendum.
See, the thing about Dutton is that he does tend to promise referendums from time to time. Here he is promising one about constitutional recognition for Aboriginal peoples even before the Voice to Parliament one had failed to pass.
And opposition leader Peter Dutton has vowed to hold a second referendum if the Voice fails and the coalition gets voted in at the next election.
So you'd hold another referendum?
I believe very strongly, yes, I believe very strongly that it is the right thing to do.
But then, after it failed, he suddenly lost his appetite for referendums.
The Federal Coalition has abandoned plans for a second referendum on Indigenous recognition.
I think it's clear that the Australian public is probably over the referendum process for some time.
See, it wasn't his fault. Those damn pesky Australian public wouldn't eat their vegetables. Now, here's the thing. A lot of people have been pointing out that Dutton's entire election campaign strategy is about copying whatever Trump is doing, right? Trump announces he's deporting Mahmoud Khalil, a Palestinian green card holder. Suddenly Dutton is all about deporting criminals with dual citizenship. Trump bans DEI program. Dutton jumps on the bandwagon, saying Australians should do the same. Trump creates a Department of Government Efficiency designed to gut the civil service. Dutton suddenly thinks we need a massive government efficiency review. At first glance, yes, it does look like Dutton is just running a cheap Australian knockoff of MAGA. But I don't think that's fair to Dutton. Peter Dutton may be many things. He may be a reptile-faced sadist who allegedly masturbates to the sounds of children screaming. He may be the kind of racist who walks out of Parliament rather than hear the apology to the stolen generation, because let's be honest, that kind of chicken shit, snowflake, I can't hear things that hurt my delicate racism sensibility bullshit is the true face of the Liberal Party. Always was and it always will be. He might even be the sort of fear-mongering, rabble-rousing, panic-creating, scapegoating asshole who says refugees will simultaneously take Australian jobs while also somehow being unemployed. He could possibly be suffering from an advanced form of hallucinatory dementia, given that he claimed Melburnians were too afraid to go out for dinner because of African gangs. And maybe he's just a big old misogynist who says things like refugee women who have been raped were, quote, trying it on. He may be some or all of those things, but what he isn't is unoriginal. Peter Dutton doesn't need a playbook for cruelty. He wrote the fucking playbook. Trump thinks he's being tough by deporting Venezuelans to El Salvador? Cute. Dutton was perfecting the art of subcontracting human rights abuses to third world countries long before Trump even ran for president. Trump wants to ban DEI? Please. Dutton was rejecting diversity before Americans even had a name for it. When Trump was still figuring out how to spell apartheid. I just want to make sure the clip is the right one. Yep, there we go. When Trump was still figuring out how to spell apartheid, Dutton was already arguing that Australia should give asylum to white South African farmers. A claim that at the time was only being pushed by far-right white supremacist groups, so it's kind of curious how Dutton had heard of it. Trump's new crackdown on public servants is just an attempt to do what Dutton was already doing, stripping funds from programs that actually help people while funding money into pet projects, border militarization, and whatever keeps his base angry enough to vote for him. At this point, Trump might as well be holding a press conference saying, I just discovered this guy. Great guy named Peter Dutton. Tremendous guy. Very strong, very nasty. A lot of people say he's too nasty. I don't think so. I practice that so hard in the fucking mirror. I'm a 46-year-old man practicing Trump impressions in the bathroom. It's horrific. So sure, you can call Dutton Australia's Trump, but let's give credit where it's due. Dutton isn't trying to be America's Trump. Trump is America's Dutton. Farmer feud news now. In a rare display of bipartisanship, both Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton have come together like two divorced parents at their child's school play to vow that the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme, or PBS, will not be touched, no matter how much the United States pharmaceutical lobby wants to bad touch it. The PBS, Australia's long-standing medicine subsidy program, has found itself in the crosshairs of America's pharmaceutical overlords, who have written to Donald Trump like a spoiled heir. They're demanding tariffs on Australian drugs because the PBS keeps medicine prices lower here than in the US, where the price of a Panadol is your firstborn child. You do not want to know what Panadol Extra costs, by the way. The US pharmaceutical lobby group claims our PBS is a, quote, discriminatory trade instrument, end quote, which is the only kind of discrimination Trump actually cares about, one that affects billionaires' profit margins. It's quite the stretch, considering the top 10 US drug companies are worth approximately $2.5 trillion. That number is actually too large to imagine. I mean, here it is numerically, but even that doesn't help. So let me try visualizing this for you. Elon Musk is worth $327.3 billion, which means the pharma companies are worth 7.6 Elon Musks. Or if you want that in Jeff Bezos's, that's 10.9 Jeff Bezos's. I bet that's a human centipede you didn't think you'd see today. Or, I'll put it in even more understandable terms without getting into details about just how little I have in savings. You can do the math yourself here. The 10 largest drug companies combined are worth 499.6 million knees. I think you get the idea. It's kind of mesmerizing, isn't it? Should be a Windows screensaver. Luckily, Albanese and Dutton have taken a back-off-mate approach. Both leaders are promising more funding for the PBS, with Labour pledging $690 million to make medicines cheaper, and the coalition doing what it does best, which is copying Labour. The only point of contention between the two parties is who gets the credit for Big Pharma not getting its way back in the early 2000s, when they also apparently lobbied hard against the PBS during Australia's US free trade negotiations. This is back in the 2000s.
The Labor Party fought that particularly hard in the Parliament and forced John Howard to put through some laws.
And John Howard put it off the table and said that it couldn't be touched and it wouldn't be touched.
So Labour says they saved the day. The Liberals say John Howard is the one who saved the day. And it turns out, well, Labour was right. Back in 2004, Howard was reluctant to accept Labour's proposal to protect drug prices in Australia. In fact, it was Labour, then being led by Mark Latham, if you want a reminder of just how weird the world was. 2004, back when the highest grossing movie of the year was Shrek 2, Martha Stewart went to prison, and Mark Latham saved our medicines. Let's try this again. Here we go. Seizing the ceasefire news now. Israel has resumed its strikes on Gaza, declaring that Hamas collapsed the truce by refusing to release hostages. But here's the kicker. Even the Times of Israel itself reports that Hamas was abiding by the original terms of the deal. It was the same deal Israel originally agreed to do before deciding it was a bad idea. It's kind of like ordering a steak, watching it cook, and then flipping the table because you suddenly remembered you're vegan. Now, Israel has maintained throughout that Hamas staying in Gaza is a non-starter. And Hamas has made it clear with the hostage handovers that it's not going anywhere, because there's one thing these two sides agree on, it's that nothing can ever be agreed upon. According to Netanyahu's office, Hamas's refusal to hand over more hostages was the final straw, which could very well be the reason why the bombing has resumed. Or it could be what was predicted by Haaretz journalist Yuri Misgaviv. 2 days earlier, he said the bombing would start on the day it did because Netanyahu had a corruption trial hearing scheduled, which has now been cancelled. Israel's government was in crisis over passing the budget, which was threatening to bring the government down, but ending the ceasefire meant far-right terrorism aficionado Itamar Ben-Gvir can rejoin the government he had previously quit in protest over the pause in killing Gazans, thus giving Netanyahu the majority he needs. Oh, and Netanyahu today fired the chief of the Shin Bet to prevent investigations into possibly money going to two of his aides from Qatar, which could be either mild bribery or straight-out treason. So, this could be about Hamas not releasing the hostages, or, and hear me out, it could also be about literally everything else. So now Israel is bombing Gaza again. Hamas is still somehow positive it has the upper hand, not realizing both its hands and the arms they were attached to were blown off long ago. Over 400 Gazans are dead in just over 48 hours, including more than 130 children, according to UNICEF. And yes, the Gazan Health Ministry doesn't distinguish between Hamas officials and civilians in that death toll. Going back to that restaurant analogy then. It's like a restaurant where the chef keeps torching the kitchen, the manager insists it's all the sous chef's fault, and the customers are left wondering why their meal keeps arriving in flames. And yet somehow we keep going back, hoping the next dish will be different. Ceasefire, more like please fire news now. In an absolute masterclass of international diplomacy, Donald Trump attempted to strong-arm Vladimir Putin into a full 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine and got about as far as a damp handshake. Instead of peace, Trump walked away with a pause on attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure.
Mr. Putin did say, however, he was willing to pause attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, but 80% of it has already been destroyed by Russian bombs.
But look, at least Trump got that, right? Sure, the Gaza ceasefire he negotiated is now buried under rubble, but at least he got this ceasefire sorted.
This is not what a ceasefire looks like. These are Russian drones striking a hospital in Sumy in the east of Ukraine, according to the emergency services. Further south, Ukraine State Railway said Russia had launched an attack on its power network.
Don't worry though, Trump has another genius idea.
President Trump suggested that the US could take ownership of Ukraine's nuclear power plants to help keep them safe.
Because nothing says lasting peace like US ownership of critical energy infrastructure. That never ended up destroying a country while enriching American businesses.
For the past 6 years, Iraq has been the scene of violence and turmoil, but its economic situation as well as its security has improved. The key to Iraq's development is its vast oil and gas reserves. At the Iraq Oil and Gas Summit held here in Houston, international oil services companies met with participants from Iraq to make contacts that could become lucrative down the road. Don Anderson represents the Amaron Company, which produces pipes and other products used in oil and gas fields.
We just had a contact that could be in excess of $5–10 million in business for our company. So this was well worth.
Oh, I can't laugh. It's strong.
Look, he's a good guy. Right about now, Zelensky's probably texting his generals to say, it might be time to get solar panels. I don't know. And finally, back from space! News now. In an incredible testament to human endurance, engineering ingenuity, and the sheer inability of large corporations to meet a deadline, 2 NASA astronauts have finally returned to Earth after being stuck in space for 9 months. Yes, after what was supposed to be a simple 10-day mission to test Boeing Starliner's capsule, astronauts Sunita Williams and Barry Butch Wilmore ended up squatting on the International Space Station since June 2024. Their return is testament to both human endurance and human ingenuity. Now all that is left is the most important question that needs to be asked is, did they boldly go where astronauts have never gone before? Did they engage in a little zero-G exploration? Did they experience some deep space docking? Did they attempt a lunar landing on each other's dark side? Did they test the thruster function on their personal escape pods? I've got a lot more. Did they take a moment for some interstellar intercourse? Did they do the Milky Way in the Milky Way? Did they give a whole new meaning to space probe? Did they find out why they call it the Big Bang? Did they defy Newton's third law and make sure every action has an equal and opposite reaction? Did they experience some orbital insertion of their own? Did they achieve liftoff and then re-entry? And then liftoff and then re-entry? And then... Look, I stopped there. I could have gone on for pages. We may never know. But one thing's for sure. What happens in orbit stays in orbit. And now that they're back on Earth, their real suffering can begin.
But when they are back on their feet, the President Donald Trump has extended an invitation to the White House.
That's it for this week's edition of News Weekly. Thank you very much, everyone.